All right, so at the end of the last lecture, we were talking about translating a Python function into a Java method. If you've had a chance to look at assignment one is all about translating Python functions into Java methods. Right? So assignment one's out, you can take a look at it. You need the content of today's lecture in order to complete it if you don't know Java. If you know Java, then it should be pretty straightforward to complete the assignment. So in Python, when you write a function, or if you write a loop, right, or an if statement, then you have to indent the blocks. You have to indent the body of the function, the loop, or the if statement, right? So indentation is fundamental in the Python language. Right? In Java, Java doesn't care about indentation, right? The compiler doesn't care, right? But you should always strive to format your code neatly in Java, right? So the equivalent Java method, you could write it like this, but this is a mess to read, right? It's very hard to parse what that's trying to say. The compiler doesn't care. It'll happily accept that and compile that program, but you should not write your code this way, right? So try to basically use the slides and the code from the lecture, that's provided for you for the course as a guideline on how to format your code. You can also use Eclipse to format your code. I don't remember. So I also teach a similar course to the engineering students. So I don't remember if I've shown you how to do this already or not. But in Eclipse, if you screw up the indentation, right, and I'm going to mess it up pretty badly, right, something like that, right, you can, don't fix it yourself, right, just ask Eclipse to fix it for you. So under the source menu, right, there's a format option, right? You can read that, right? So there's a format option, and the format option will format all of your code for you, right? And it'll, right? So it'll make sure that the formatting for your entire file is consistent. Right? All right. So Java is a brace delimited language, right? So it's similar to languages like C and C++. Well, all the C-like languages are brace delimited, right? So bodies of methods, classes, if statements, loops, and probably other things are delimited by pairs of matched braces. Right? So the body of the class delimited by the red braces. Right? The body of the method delimited by the blue braces. Right? The braces are required. In this example, they're required everywhere. There are cases where you write a loop or an if statement where they're not required. But I recommend you always put the braces in. Right? Now this class is marked as being public, right? And so in Java you have the ability to control the visibility of a class, right? Which is you cannot do in Python, right? So in Java you can mark the class as being public, which indicates that all other classes everywhere can see this class. Right? So in other words, lecture 2 is usable to every other class, right? So that's what public means. That's what public means when you mark a class with that access modifier. Right, so that's called an access modifier in Java. On a method, the public access modifier means that any other class can use the method. Right? And so later on in the course, you're going to see that there are other types of access modifiers. Right? There's 4 different access modifiers for methods. There's 2 different access modifiers for top-level classes. Right? For now, everything's public. And now on our method max2, it's also marked as being static. Right? And so static, again, for the time being, all of our methods will be static. That's going to change next week. Right? But for now, everything's static. So a static modifier means that the method, in this case max2, right, is associated with the class lecture2. And it's not associated with an object whose type is lecture2. Right? So static means belongs to the class. Right? When you want to call the method max2, you use the name of the class to get to the max2 method. Right? If the method's not static, then you need an object to get to the method. Right? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Right? So for now, everything's static. If you have a public static method, that's the closest thing to a Python function that you can have in the Java language. So like Python functions, Java methods have parameters. Right? So in this case, there's 2, right? A and B. Right? Now, you can think of the parameters as just being variables, so A and B, that are local or belong to the max2 method. Right? And so you can use the names A and B inside that pair of braces. Right? So anywhere inside the body of max2, you have access to the names A and B. Right? Like all variables in Java, they have to have a type. So the type of A is int and the type of B is int. Right? You can have 0 parameters up to an unlimited number of parameters. Java methods are allowed to return 0 or 1 value, right? Which is very different than in Python. Right? So in Python, you can return a tuple of values, right? Where there can be an arbitrary number of values in the tuple, right? So you can return 1, 2, 3, 4, or 100 values from a Python function, which is very handy in many cases. Right? In Java, you don't have that flexibility. So you either return nothing or you return exactly 1 value. Right? So if a method wants to return a value, it must say that it returns a value of a particular type. And that's what this int means right here. Right? So the return type goes in front of the method name. Right? So in this case, max2 returns an int. If your method does not return a value, then the method must say it returns void. Right? So void means, in this context, void means returns no value. Right? So the main method in Java always returns void or returns no value. Okay, so if your method is going to return a value, then it must, so if it says it returns a value, then it must return a value. Right? And this is also very different than in Python, right? So in Python, you never declare whether or not a function returns a value. Right? If you have a return statement inside the function, then it returns a value. Right? But you never actually have to say that the function returns a value. Right? So the return statement, just like in Python, returns a value in Java. Right? So again, just like in Python, your method stops running immediately after the return statement. Right? So immediately at this point here, right, that marks the end of that particular method. So the return type here is int. Right? Whatever value you return, in this case twice max divided by 2, that has to be compatible with int. Right? For the most part in Java, that means it has to, well, the simplest way to think about this for the time being is that if your method says it returns an int, then it has to return an int. Right? And a void method has no return statement. Right? So if you have a method that returns void, you don't need a return statement. If you want to, though, you are allowed to use an empty return statement. Right? This is sometimes useful. It's sometimes useful if you want to exit a method early. So you have some condition where you know you don't have to do anything, you'd like to get out of the method right away, so you can just do return. Right? And if the condition's not true, you can do some other stuff. Right? So it's occasionally useful. Yes?
Is it problematic though? Like people look down on it?
It depends on who you talk to. So what's the best way to answer this? I would say that some academics will frown down upon it. I think practicing programmers will not. I think that's the fairest way to say that. It's going to depend on where you, it really depends on where you end up being employed, who you end up being employed by. Right? So when you go out and work in the real world, if you go to work for a large company, well, even a small company, typically they will have a set of standards in place that dictate how you must write your code. Right? How should you format your code? How should you name stuff? Should you put a return statement in, or should you return early from a method or not, and things like that. Right? And so those will all be dictated later on. For the purposes of this course, it doesn't bother me if you return early from a method. Right? Some academics will complain, but academics like to complain. Okay, so Python if statement changes the way, is similar to, Python if changes the program flow based on one or more conditions. Right? So if you want to write a sensible max method, in this case the max of 3 values, you would just use some kind of if statement. Right? So one way to write this in Python is as follows. Right? I want to find the max of A, B, and C. Right? So if A is greater than or equal to B, and A is greater than or equal to C, well, A must be the maximum value. Right? So I'm going to make a variable called result, and I'll assign the value A to the result. Right? And similarly, you can do the same thing for B. Right? Using an else if. Using the else if part of the if statement, right? And if you know that A is not the max and B is not the max, then it must be the case that C is the max, right? And now you can return the result down here. Right, so this is one way to do it. There's many, many ways to write this particular function. Right? Notice in Python, the AND operator is just the word AND. Right? In Java, that's not the case. Right? So in Java, the AND operator is the double ampersand. Right? So AND and AND. Right? Two ANDs, it's important, right? Because there's also a single AND operator, which does something else. Right? So in this case, it has to be the double ampersand. Right, so that's your logical AND. So you can write this exactly the same way. Right? I can write in Python, remember, when you declare a variable for the first time, it gets created. In Java, that's not the case. Right? So in Java, I have to declare result before I try to use it. Right? Similarly, I need to use result after the if statement. So result has to be declared before the if statement. Right? If I try to declare it here, for example, then you're going to see shortly that the variable result will not be usable down here. Right? But for now, let's just look at the structure of this thing. Right? So it's almost exactly the same as the Python if statement. Right? It's if. Instead of elif, it's else if. Right? Else is the same. Right? Again, notice the braces are used instead of indentation to denote the blocks of the if, else if, and else parts. The condition must appear inside the round brackets, right? So you must use parentheses for the condition. The condition has to be something that evaluates to true or false, right? And in this case is the double ampersand. Right. Now, I've said there's lots of ways to write this method, or I guess in Python, this function. So one way to write the function is instead to assume the maximum value is C, right? And then write the if statement to check whether or not it's A or B, right? And this lets you remove the else clause, right? So notice here, there's no else. So just like in Python, the else part is optional in Java, right? So you can write the more or less the exact same code in Java. Again, conditions must appear inside the parentheses, right? There's this notion of scope in Java. So the scope of a variable is the region of code where the variable is usable. So if you declare parameters for your method, right, then the scope of those variables are the entire body of the method. Right? So A, B, and C are usable throughout the entire method. Right? Outside the method, they're not usable. Right? But inside the method, they're usable everywhere. The scope of a variable is limited to starts at the point of its declaration. So the scope of result starts here, right? And it ends at the end of the block in which it's declared in, right? So starts here. The block that it's declared in is all of this. So it ends right there. Right? So that's the usable part. That's where result is usable. Right? So the result, the scope is from the equals C to the end of the method. Right? Now, if you try to write your Java code exactly like the Python code, you run into problems. Right? And so if you say, well, I need a result variable, so I'm going to declare it inside this if statement block. Right? So double result equals A. Right? What's the scope of this result? Well, it starts here, and it ends there. So when you try to return the result, the compiler complains and says, hey, result doesn't exist at this point in time. Right? The error you get says no declared variable named result. Right? So this code, the if part of this will all compile. Right? It's the returning the result part down here that doesn't compile. So you have to pay attention to scope. You have to pay more attention to scope in Java than you do in Python. You are allowed to have more than one return statement. So again, just like Python, right? So if you know that the maximum value is A, then you can simply return A here. Right? Similarly, if you know the maximum value is B, then you can simply return B here. Right? And down here, you can simply return C. Right? And I think this is related to your previous question. Right? Some people will tell you you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't have more than one return statement in a function or method. right? In practice, I would say most practicing programmers will often write more than one return statement in a function or method. Now, after a return statement, right, remember the method stops immediately after the return statement runs, so you're not allowed to put any code immediately after the return statement. Right? So after returning A, you can't put anything here. Right? You can put a comment there, but you can't put any meaningful code there. Right? If you do put some code there, the compiler will refuse to compile your code. Right? It'll say this code is unreachable. Right? It's unreachable because you've got a return statement here, right? And that ends the method. Right? So similarly, no code here, no code allowed here. Yes. So this is another common error that new-ish programmers will make. Right? They'll write their if statements using a bunch of else-if blocks. Right? And so in this particular example here, right, if A is the maximum value, we want to return A. Right? Else if B is the maximum value, we would like to return B. Right? Else if C is the maximum value, we would like to return C. Right? The compiler will complain about this particular piece of code. Right? The error that you'll get is that it'll say, your method is not returning a value, even though it says it returns a value. Right? And you look at your code and you say, well, yes, it must return a value, right? It's either the case that A, B, or C is the maximum. This has a return statement for all three. Why doesn't it work? And the answer is because your compiler is not a mathematician, right? It's simply reading your code, right? So it sees there's an if statement here, right? So the compiler says, well, that might be true, but it might be false. So return A may or may not run. Right? It now sees an else if statement here, right? And it says, well, that may or may not run. And it sees there's an else if part here. So it says that may or may not run, right? And it concludes, return A, return B, or return C may never run, right? And so it expects there to be a return statement down here, right? And so your compiler is not a mathematician, or at least it's not a very good one. Right? And so it can't infer that this must be logically correct. It is logically correct, right? Mathematically it's correct, but the compiler can't infer that, right? So the correct answer here is don't use else if here, right? Just use an else, and everything will be fine. Or remove the else, that third clause altogether. Okay, so we've seen that and, double ampersand is Java's logical and operator. I should mention something here now, so I'm just going to, I need to go find my Python code, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate this slide. So give me a second here. And I'm going to rewrite this function in a different way, right? So you can write this in Python the following way. So A is the maximum value. So if, what is the, oh wait, sorry, hold on. No, never mind, I'm wrong. I was thinking about this walking on the way in, but it turns out I'm wrong. So I do want to show you an example though. I have to cook something up here. So I'm just going to write down some random Python code. Right. So in Python, you can check if a value is between two values, like so. Right. So if right. So in Python, that's perfectly legal. Right. Hopefully, you all saw that in your Python course. Right. In Java, you can't do that. Right. So this checks is x greater than 0 and is it less than 5. Right. So you are allowed to chain your conditional operators in Python. Right. So the equivalent code in Java right would have to be oops. Oh, there we go. Right. So in Java, you cannot chain the conditional operators. Right. And so the way that the Java compiler will try to decipher, oh, sorry. The way that the Java compiler will try to read that statement there, right? It'll say, well, you've got a 0, a less than, and an x, right? And so they're trying to compare two values, right? So is x greater than 0, right? So the compiler says, well, okay, that evaluates to a Boolean value, right? So that evaluates to true or false. And now it keeps going, right? So now it says, is true less than 5? And it says, hey, that doesn't make sense, right? And so the Java's compiler does not interpret that statement the same way that the Python interpreter interprets that statement, right? So you have to use the AND operator here. This is inconvenient if you're a pure Python, if you're someone who only knows how to program in Python, right? That you have to remember to do this sort of thing, right? So no chaining of your conditional operators in Java. Oh, okay, so double ampersand is the logical AND operator, right? Oops, sorry. Double vertical bar is the logical OR operator, right? There is a single bar as well. You don't want to use the single bar, right? You want to use the double vertical bar. Okay, so this little method here determines whether or not a year is a leap year, right? And so a year is a leap year if it's divisible by 400, right? Evenly divisible by 400, right? But it's also a leap year if it's evenly divisible by 4, but not evenly divisible by 100, right? So 2100 is not a leap year, right? It's divisible by 4, but it's not. But it's also divisible by 100, right? And it's not divisible by 400, right? So the year 2000 was a leap year, right? And similarly, the year 2400 will be a leap year, probably. Right? Time's weird, so it's strange. There's all sorts of complications with time. One of the most complicated classes in your programming libraries are the classes that deal with time. So to write this statement, right, you can say, well, is the year evenly divisible by 400? So that's Java's remainder operator, right? So take year, divide it by 400, and compute the remainder, right? So for example, if year is 2000, 2000 divided by 400 is 5, no remainder. So if the remainder is equal to 0, then that condition is true, right? I now have an OR, and I have an AND over here, right? And so the way that Java evaluates this statement is it evaluates that first, right? Now that AND has higher precedence than that OR, so it evaluates this stuff over here second, right? So take the year, divide it by 4, look at the remainder, right? Is it equal to 0, right? Take the year, divide it by 100, is it not 0, right? And then after it knows, is this true or false? Is all of this true or false? Does it do the OR? Right? So the OR has lower precedence than AND. If this bothers you, and it should bother you a little bit, it's hard to read, right? You can always use parentheses to be explicit about what order you want your operations to occur in, right? So just use parentheses, parentheses. Anything inside parentheses always has highest precedence, right? And so now it's obvious that you have two separate conditions being evaluated here. Okay, this is, so I see this a lot in students who take this particular course, and you see it a lot even in second and third year, right? You have an if statement here, right? An if statement needs a logical condition, right? So it needs something that's true or false, right? This is basically saying if this statement is true, return true, right? Otherwise, return false, right? You don't need an if statement, right? All you need to do is evaluate that Boolean expression, right? So rather than writing the if statement, you can simply return the result of the Boolean expression, right? And that simplifies your code, right? To an experienced programmer, that's easier to read than that, right? And so you should, if you plan on doing more programming in the future, right? In particular, if you plan on doing a career that involves programming, you should start to train yourself to write code like this, right? Rather than writing code like this. In this course, no one's going to knock marks off. Like, no one's going to take marks off because you're writing this sort of thing here, right? That is generally easier to read. If you want not, and often you need not, right? The exclamation mark is Java's not operator, right? So this little method here computes the number of days in February, right? Number of days in February depends on whether or not the year is a leap year, right? So here, the way I've written it, I've decided to call is leap year to check the year, right? And so if that year is not a leap year, right, then there's 28 days in the month, otherwise there's 29 days, right? The only reason it's written this way is to show you how to use not, right? All right, oh yeah, here it is. Here's the change comparison operators. I knew I had to talk about it somewhere. So this one converts your numeric grade into a letter grade, right? It doesn't do Queen's letter grades because there's too many categories, right? So if your grade is greater than or equal to 80, the result is an A, right? Else if your grade is between 70 and 80, your result is a B, right? And so on and so on and so on. You can't write that line there in Java, right? You have to use the AND operator like that. Okay, any questions about lecture, what was that, lecture slide 3, I think, the lecture deck 3. All right, so moving on. So this is the lecture that you need to complete the assignment, because the assignment is basically has you manipulate a bunch of arrays. Okay. So in Python, you've got these things called sequences, right? One of the sequences that you have is a list, right? And so you know that you make a list in Python, you use the square brackets, right? You can easily make a list if you know what the elements are that you want in the list, just by writing out the list like that, right? So that makes the list A, B, C, D, right? You can grab an element out of the list using an index, right? So using an integer value, you can select a value from the list. So Python lists are indexed starting at 0. So T square bracket 0 is the first element of the list, right? It's the A. Right? The last element of the list, if you insist on using a non-negative index, right, is the length of the list minus 1. Right? Notice that to get the length of a sequence in Python, you use the length function, len function. Right? Also in Python, if you want the last element of a list, you can just use the index -1. Right? Similarly, you can assign to elements in the list, also using the square bracket notation. All right, so in Java, Java has lists, but the way that you use a list is very different than the way that you use a Python list. Right? But they have more or less the same functionality. Okay. Java also has these things called arrays. The way you use an array looks an awful lot like you use a Python list, right? However, arrays are very different from lists. Right? Okay, so an array is a container object that can hold a fixed number of values of a single type, right? So I can make an array that can hold, say, 5 ints, right? And it will always hold 5 ints. Right? Or I can make an array that holds 12 strings, and it will always hold 12 strings. Right? The length of an array is established when you create the array. Right? So when you actually make the array object, the length of the array is now fixed. Right? And that's very different than a Python list, because you can put stuff into a list, you can take stuff out of a list. Right? You can make the list as big or as small as you want. Right? Arrays don't work that way in Java. Right? The array always has a fixed length. So if I want a variable that can hold an array, right, you give your variable a name, so I'm going to call it collection, right? You write down the element type that you want to store in the array. So I'm going to make an array of double values. And you put the empty square brackets after the type. If you want to, you can put them after the variable name. I think it's more common in Java to put it after the type. So double square bracket collection says that collection is a variable that can refer to an array, right? What it doesn't say, right, but there is no array here yet, right? That comment is kind of misleading, right? Collection can refer to. That's more precise. Right? So there's no array yet. All you have is a variable. That variable, you can point that variable at an array of some kind. right? So if you try to use collection, right? So if you write collection square bracket 0 to try to get an element or to try to set an element of the array, that's going to not work, right? You don't have an array yet. Okay, now a Java array is a lot less flexible than a Python list, right? But the way you use it looks a lot like a Python list, right? So in particular, you can't slice an array, right? So there's no way to take out, there's no easy way to get, say, the middle 3 elements of a Java array, right? Python, you just use a slice. No negative indexing, right? If you try to use a negative index, that results in an error, right? You get an exception being thrown. You can put whatever you want into a Python list, right? You can put in a string, then a double, then an int, then whatever you want, right? Sorry, a float, I guess, right? And then you can put in another list if you like, right? In Java, an array only holds elements of a single type, right? So if I want an array that looks like the Python list that I showed you from before, right? Then in Java, you would make an array of char, right? So char is the type that you use to represent characters, right? So the character A, right? The character B, the character C, the character D. Notice single quotes, not double quotes here, right? Single quotes indicates a char in Java, right? Double quotes indicates a string, and they're two distinct things in Java, right? Python doesn't have the notion of a char, right? In Python, the elements of a string are also strings, right? But the elements of a string in Java are chars. If I want the first element of the array, I just use the familiar square bracket notation that you'd use in Python, right? If you want the last element of an array, you don't use there's no function called len, right? There's no functions at all in the language, right? Instead, you ask the array, how big is it, right? So the way you ask anything, any object about some of its properties in Java is you write the variable name and then follow that with a period, right? So in this particular case, right, t period length asks the array for the number of elements in the array, right? So not len round brackets t, right? T dot length, right? Arrays are indexed starting at 0, so the last element must be, the index is the length minus 1, right? And if you want to set elements of the array, you can do that too, right? Again, the exact same way that you do in Python. You can initialize an array when you create it, right? So remember back here, no array yet, right? Here, t is a variable that refers to an array, and that's the array that it refers to. So you can use the braces and a comma-separated list to initialize an array. But you can only do it when you declare the array variable here, right? So if you declare the array variable here but don't initialize it immediately, right, you can no longer use this brace notation to assign a value to the array, right? So this doesn't work, right? Up here, this is called initialization, right? Declare the variable and assign it a value at the same time, right? Here, that's variable declaration, so declare that u exists, but there's no assignment, so it's not initialization, right? That next line is assignment, right? Take an existing variable, assign it a value, right? You can't assign u a brace initialized array in this case, right? The language doesn't let you do that. It would be nice if it did, but it doesn't let you do that. Okay, so to make an array, you use what's called the new operator, right? And you say, how big is the array? Right? So to actually make an array that collection can refer to, right, you write collection equals and then new, right? I want an array of double, so I write double. Then I write the square brackets and I say, how long should this array be, right? So this says that collection refers to an array of 10 double values. That number there, 10, that's the length, or you'll often see it called the capacity of the array. Right? So when you make an array using new, right, the elements of the array are always initialized for you. Right? So here's a little program. Right? We make an array of Booleans, so 3 Boolean values. Right? Next we make an array of 4 int values, and here we make an array of 5 double values. So I'm just going to go to Eclipse because I have this program sitting right here somewhere. let me get rid of this, and let me get rid of this, and I'll put that back in later. Okay, so there's the program, right? If you run it, right, you'll end up seeing, so there's an array of 3 Boolean values, and they're all set to false. Right? The next line is an array of 4 int values, and they're all set to 0. And the next line is an array of 5 double values, they're all set to 0. Right? So in Java, when you use new to create an array, everything gets the elements get initialized for you. Right? It's easy to remember. If it's a Boolean array, everything is false. If it's otherwise, everything is 0, right? If you're using an array of primitive type. Now, what happens if you have an array of reference type? So what happens if you make an array of strings? Right? So string, square bracket, some strings, new string, I don't know, 10. Right? And then print out the array. Right, when you run that, what do you get? Well, I get an array of length 10. You can count the number of nulls there if you want to, right? But the value that you see there is the value called null, N-U-L-L, right? If you know what nil is in Python, this is the same thing, right? So null in Java means no object, right? That's what it means. So you have an array of 10 strings, right? So there's your array, right? But all of your string, sorry, let me back up one second. You actually don't have an array of 10 strings here. Sorry, come on. You don't really have an array of 10 strings. What you have to remember is that all reference types in Java, their values are references. So really what you have here is an array of 10 references to strings, right? If a reference is null, that means that it refers to nothing, right? It does not refer to an actual object, right? So what you have here is an array of 10 references, right? All the references are set to null. That indicates that there's no actual string object corresponding to each one of those elements, right? If you want a string object for each one of those elements, you now have to assign values to the array, right? So for example, some strings, 0, right? So I can set the first element of the array so that it refers to the string hello, right? And now you get hello followed by 9 nulls, right? So there's one string, right? So the first reference actually refers to a string object that happens to be the string hello, right? But the next element in the array refers to no string, right? And the next element refers to no string, and so on, and so on, and so on. Right? If you actually want to use, so if you try to use null for something, right? So for example, if I try to call some method belonging to the second element in the array, right? You'll end up getting an error. You'll get something called a null pointer exception, right? And so we'll see more about null when we start talking about objects later on. Right? But an array, a reference type, is also initialized. Everything gets initialized to null. Right? So it's occasionally useful to, when you create an array, to fill it with some value that's not false 0 or null. Right? And so there's a method. Oh wait, sorry, I have to tell you something else. Back up. Printing an array. Okay, so if you want to print an array, unfortunately, it's slightly convenient, right? In Python, you just print the list, right? And everything's fine. If you try to print if you just try to print the array itself, so I'm going to print some bools, you end up getting something that looks very strange, right? So when I just print some bools, I get some gibberish here, right? Square bracket Z at 1C4A F 82C, which means nothing to a human reader, right? And so if you just print out if you just print out an array, what you end up with is something that corresponds to the address of the array in memory. But it doesn't help you at all, right? It's not useful for you to know that this array lives at that address. right? And so you get gibberish, more or less, right? If you want to print out the contents of the array, right, you use a method called toString, and that method lives in the class called arrays, big A-R-R-A-Y-S, right, which you can see is imported up here. Right? So the arrays class lives in the package called java.util. Right? It's the class that contains a bunch of methods that operate on arrays. Right? So for example, converting an array, calculating the string representation of an array. Right? And so that's what the toString method does. Right? So if you call arrays toString and pass the array to the toString method, right, that goes through the array element by element and converts each element to a string, right, and then puts some square brackets and some commas and spaces in between the elements and produces you a nice readable version of your array. Right? So to print an array, call arrays.toString and pass in the array and then print that result. Right? So a little bit inconvenient, especially compared to Python. If you take sys220, you're going to see that in C, it's much harder to print an array. You actually have to write the loop yourself. Right? So on the assignment, you're going to have to print an array a few times. So remember, it's arrays.toString. Okay, so there's a fill method in the arrays class, right? So the arrays class, that's the class that has a bunch of, that's the class that has a bunch of methods that operate on arrays, right? So for example, you can binary search an array and some other things as well, right? Fill sets all the elements of the array to some value that you specify, right? So if I fill the array sum doubles with the value 1, do I show you yet? No. You end up with an array of 10 ones. Right? So when you print that out, you get 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 10 times. Right? This is occasionally useful. The number of the elements in the array is stored in what's called a field, and its name is length. Right? So when you write collection.length, right, this thing called length is actually a variable that belongs to the array. Right? Variables that belong to an object are called fields in Java. Right? And so collection.length, you're just accessing a variable that belongs to the array. You cannot assign a value to length. Right? So if you write collection.length equals 3, the compiler will say that's an error. Right? So this is a read-only variable that belongs to the array. The type of length is always int in Java. Right? So the elements of the values in the array are called elements, right? They probably called this, they probably use the same terminology in Python, right, in your 121 course, sorry, right? Each element has an index associated with it, right? So that element has the index 0, that element has the index 1, right, and so on and so on and so forth, right? The last valid index is always the length minus 1, right? There's no negative indexing, which is also unfortunate, right? The negative indexing in Python is very useful for when you're writing many types of functions, right? But you don't have that. You don't have negative indexes in Java. If you try to use an index that's not valid, you get an error, right? So remember, collection is an array of 10 doubles, right? So I can set the first value to 100. I can ask for the first value. I can set the second through the 10th value to 100. If I try to set the 11th value of the array, you end up with an exception. Right? In particular, you end up with this thing called an array index out of bounds exception. Right? So every time you access the array, the access is checked. Right? Collection 0, is 0 a valid index? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you get an error. Right? Collection 1, is 1 a valid index? Yes or no? If it's not, you get an error. Right? Collection 10, well, 10 is not a valid index, so you get an error. The same thing happens in Python, right? So if you try to use an index that's not valid for a Python sequence, you also get an exception. Okay, so if you loops, right? So in Python only has one for loop, right? It's always for some variable in some sequence, right? Or some, is it sequence? Wow, for our purposes it's a sequence, right? So for each element in the list T, right? And that's the only for loop that's the only style of loop that you can write in Python, right? You probably would have learned a loop that counts, probably from 0 to some number, right? So that would look like for element in range something, right? But it's still the same style of for loop, right? This is still what's called a for each loop, right? So for each element in the list T, right? Do something with the element, right? So that just finds the maximum value inside the list of a non-empty list. Right? So Java also has a for each loop, right? You write it differently, but it behaves the same way, right? So the syntax is for, parentheses, so the parentheses are required, right? Now instead of elem in T, right, you write elem colon, and then in this case, the array that you want to loop over, right? So for each element in ARR, right? Now this is actually a variable declaration, right? So elem is a variable that you can use inside the for loop. All variables in Java have a type, so you have to put the type here, right? So for each double element in ARR, right, and now the rest of it is the same as the Python loop, right? So if you want to use a for each loop, you can. But in many situations, you're going to want the loop variable to correspond to the index of the element, right? So a different way to write the max, a different way so this particular method doesn't find the maximum value, it finds the index of the maximum value in the list, right? Because maybe you want to change it to some other value, right? So instead of using a for each loop that looks at each element at a time, right? I want a for each loop that looks at each index at a time, right? And so when you do that, you use this thing called range, right? In Python, that looks like a function call, but it's not a function call, right? What's actually happening here is you're making a range object that starts at 0 and goes up to, but not including the length of t minus 1. That goes up to, but not including the length of t, right? So that range object knows how to count from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to the length of t minus 1. Right? And that's actually what's happening here. That's not a function call, right? Even though it sort of looks like one, right? Now inside the loop, I can use I. I is just an index, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And I can write my max index method, a function this way, right? If you want a counting style loop in Java, there is no range class in Java, right? Instead, you have to resort to the older style. This is actually a C style loop. So this comes from the programming language called C, right? And it's not as nice to write as the Python range-based loop, right? And so the way you write this is you create your loop variable yourself, right? So I want it to be an index, so it's always an int in Java, right? So int, and then I make my loop variable, in this case I give it an initial value, so I want the loop to start counting at 0, right? And now this variable I is usable inside of the loop body, right? So I is now my index for my array. Okay, so a regular for loop, so a not for each loop, always has 4 parts. It does not always have 4 parts. It has 4 main parts. So number 1 is the initialization expression. That's the int I equals 0. Right? Number 2 is the termination condition, right? That determines when should the loop run, right? And finally, there's an update expression, and so that says what should happen at the end of the loop, right? The 4th part is the body of the loop, right? So that's the thing that runs every time the loop runs, right? Parts 1, 2, and 3, they're all optional, right? But it's actually somewhat unusual to see a loop that doesn't have all of 1, 2, and 3, right? The semicolons always show up, whether or not parts 1, 2, and 3 are there, right? So there's always 2 semicolons, right? Initialization expression, that's the thing that initializes the loop, right? So the first time, when that line of code runs, right? So when you get to the for statement, the int I equals 0 runs once, right? Termination expression, so that's the second part. So the thing after the first semicolon, right? If that condition is true, then the loop will run, right? This condition gets checked every time the loop might run, right? So the first time it runs, it's going to check, is I less than the array length, right? If it is, the body of the loop will run, right? If it evaluates to false, the loop does not run, right? It stops running and flow ends up back after the loop. Right? The update expression gets evaluated at the end of every loop iteration, right? So right here, right, every time the loop body runs, that now runs, right? I++, so you don't have plus plus in Python. So I++ is similar, but not exactly the same as I plus equals 1 in Python, or I equals I plus 1 in Python, right? So the effect here is to increment the value of I by 1, right? But it also has a side effect. The side effect's not important right now. So I++ increase the value of I by 1. I minus minus decreases the value of I by 1, right? There's also a plus plus I and a minus minus I. For the time being, they do the same thing, right? The value of I goes up by 1, the value of I goes down by 1. Okay, last slide, and then I think we'll have to call it quits. Right. So if you might ask, so why is there this other kind of loop, right? And the answer is it's because there's a lot of types of loops that you can't write using just a for each loop, right? So in a for each loop, you get access to one element of the sequence at a time. If you need to access more than one element of the, in this case, the array at a time, right, you probably want a counting style loop, right? So if I want to check is an array sorted, right, I want to look at the first and second elements of the array, check if they're in the correct order, right? Then I want to check is the second and third element in the correct order, right? And then the third and the fourth, and so on, right? So I have to look at two elements at the same time. So here I'm going to write my loop, and I'm going to start at index 1, so the second element, right? I want to go up to the last element, right? So the index of the last element is the array length minus 1, right? So I want the loop to run as long as I is less than the array length, right? Each time through the loop, I want to increase I by 1, right? Inside the loop, I'm going to look at the element at index I, and I'm going to compare it to the one in front, which is the element at index I minus 1, right? That's why I started at 1 and not 0, right? If I had started at 0, 0 minus 1 is minus 1, and that's an invalid index, right? So you have to pay very careful attention to make sure the indexes you're using are valid, right? So is the previous element bigger than the next element? If its answer is true, then the array is not sorted in ascending order. So I can set is sorted to false, right? I think you know enough now to complete the assignment. If not, you'll definitely know enough after the next class, right? But I'm pretty sure you know enough now. All right, so I'll see you next week.